And, depending on the diameter of the well, or maybe you could inch your way up if you were like super athletic or something. But yeah, how do you get out of a
One
well?
of those parkour people.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. That's it. And so the frogs go on to learn parkour in the story. In the story.
The end.
Yeah,
So
right.
the
That's
moral
it.
really
We
is
just
learn parkour.
that's it. Welcome again to another episode of the Table of Content, where fanciful fare is served up daily for the imagination. My name is Michael. It's a joy to be with you, and I'm joined by my sterling co-host, Albert. Albert, how are you today?
You say sterling, and I'm expecting you to say like sterling silver.
That's right. My sterling silver co-host, Albert.
I am highly polished.
he's,
Actually, not really.
he's of the finest metal.
It's sort of a cheaper grade, like silver plated,
Right.
maybe.
Exactly.
Just lead underneath.
Right. I'm aluminum plated, so.
But you're recyclable.
Yeah, exactly right.
You can just keep coming back.
Just keep coming back. I'm resilient like that.
I'm good. Always good to sit down and talk with you.
Good. Right.
So what do we got? What's going on today?
So today we're delving into another Aesop
We love
fable.
Aesop.
Oh,
We
yeah.
love Aesop.
Aesop.
Do you love Aesop as much as we love Aesop? We really like Aesop.
Aesop is so deceptively simple on the outside, and yet there's such a profundity. There's so much to talk about in Aesop, and there's ideas there that span throughout the centuries. So
Sort of like a gusher, right? You're like, oh, it's just a little fruit chew, and then an explosion of fruit juice, high
flavor.
fructose corn syrup.
That's right. You're right. Exactly.
Yes.
It's just it tickles the taste buds of the imagination. Time and time again. It never gets old. Right?
So, what does Aesop have?
So today we have the story of the two frogs, right? And if you're not familiar with the fable of the two frogs, I invite you at this moment to pause the video, listen to our We Are One Body audio theater production of the two frogs by Aesop, and then we can come back and we can talk about it. But we're just going to jump right into the story. So the story. Do you remember the story, Albert? How the story goes with the two frogs?
Yeah, we've got two frogs. They kind of have their, favorite watering hole, but they need to find a new place to live. The water is diminishing, so they go about their ways, and one of them sees a well. It's like, we can live in the well. It's like, look, it's got water. And the other one says, that's great, but what happens if the water goes down? We're going to be stuck.
Right.
So, how does Aesop end it? What's the moral?
The moral of the story is do nothing without a regard to the consequence, right?
And getting stuck in a well for at least the frogs could be a pretty severe consequence. Actually, I think anyone getting stuck in a well might be having some heavy consequences.
Right. That would not be a very pleasant experience, I don't think, being stuck in a well, right? And, depending on the diameter of the well, or maybe you could inch your way up if you were like super athletic or something. But yeah, how do you get out of a
One
well?
of those parkour people.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. That's it. And so the frogs go on to learn parkour in the story. In the story.
The end.
Yeah,
So
right.
the
That's
moral
it.
really
We
is
just
learn parkour.
That's it. No, but there's so much here. And I was first struck with an Aesop fable, the characters and the story itself. The characters and the situation all have symbolism, right? So we can talk about the two frogs themselves, right? And their character traits. I thought we could go into that a little bit, right? You have the one who is aware of their situation and the other who's willing to think about making a change, right? So you have on the one hand caution and you have on the other action, right? And how do those two dynamics overlay? And is there a balance to be set? Then you have the situation. One well is drying up, or one water source is drying up, and so they go on this journey to look for a new home to dwell in, which in and of itself is sort of an adventure, a daunting experience. And then they find what seems to be an ideal place, right? But then there's also caution and action, right? One says, this is great, this is it, it has what we need. But the other is, well, caution, let's think about this for a moment. Is this really a good place, right? So I feel like, what do you think in terms of the character traits of the frogs? Like, is caution really, uh, sometimes confused with fear, being afraid, or is there a real wisdom in caution? What do you think, Albert?
I think from the human dynamic, caution can be used to protect oneself, right?
Mm,
Caution can be used to make good decisions. Caution can be used to look ahead towards bigger life decisions, right? Because you're looking at consequences. You're looking that whole, well, this will lead to this, will lead to this, will lead to this.
mm,
You can use caution in a lot of ways. You can use caution when you cross the road. Why? Because you don't want to get hit by the car.
right.
You can use caution when you're climbing the stairs. I'll make sure I hit the right step. I mean, you can use caution in the most basic way, and you can use caution in an extreme way,
Mm,
um, to an extent where it can sort of be almost sort of debilitating, right? So,
mm,
like, to where it leads to an unhealthy fear, right? There's too much
yeah,
caution, there's too much consideration.
right.
But I think that caution in its best form is a good thing that we carry with us in our lives.
Right.
So again, we see where caution is a good thing, sometimes could be a bad thing.
Yeah, I like how you said that. It's a virtue, right? That idea of like, do nothing without regard to the consequences, right? Which is a healthy mindset to have. There's an excess there that one can fall into where then everything then becomes daunting, and then that sort of prevents one from doing the right action, right? I feel like that's like an overabundance of caution, right? I've heard that line in like emails, right? Have an overabundance of caution, right? We want to err on the side of caution, right? But then on the other hand as well, you can't just kind of be reckless, right? Or just go and take any kind of decision without thinking through it first, because that also can lead to negative consequences
Hmm.
in any kind of decision, right? Yeah, so there is that balance that has to be struck between caution on the one hand and action on the others, right? Think about the consequences, but then when it actually does come time to act, we ought to take the proper course of action, right?
I think the perfect setup would be is that our higher faculties, the intellect and the will, are working with all of the senses, right? And one part of the interior of the mind is like saying, "Okay, hang on.
Mm,
Let's be careful here.
yeah,
You know, let's be cautious. Let's approach carefully." But then once we've had time to analyze, hopefully, the intellect and the will say, "Okay, it's time to act." Especially again going back to the faith life. I mean, Christ calls us to action in our lives,
mm,
right?
mm-hmm,
He doesn't call us. Yes, we're supposed to pray. Yes, there are those who are contemplative. Yes, there are the desert fathers
mm,
who were hermits, right?
mm,
But they 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 took action to the call, right?
right.
You
Yes,
you 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 can't say, well, that nun who's cloistered and doesn't get to come out to see anyone and spends her life praying with a group of other women quietly,
right.
there's no action there. No, they were called,
Yes,
discerned, made sure
yes.
they were. I guess there was maybe some. Am I being cautious? Be careful. Okay, I need to go.
Right.
and then they act,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
You know, Saint Joseph, New Testament Saint Joseph, right? Angel says, "You got to go," and there's action, right?
Right.
I think God calls us sometimes to immediate action, and
Yes.
you go.
Yeah.
And God sort of then plants seeds the other time, and it's like,
Right.
all right, I'm going to put a seed here. Oh, there's this growing desire, thought, feeling. What is God calling me to? All right. Well, the mind and the intellect and the will have all
Yeah.
decided
Right.
this is a good thing. Go.
Right.
In the moral life, the mind and the intellect hopefully said this is not a good thing, so I'm
Right.
not going to act.
Right.
But hopefully there's a good connection between caution and action.
Yes. Right. I love how you said that, Albert, because all of those examples that you offered bring us sort of the next dynamic of the story itself. That Aesop, for whatever reason, decided to include two frogs. Right? There's dialogue. I was thinking, what would have happened if just like the adventuresome frog just kind of went out and did it, and the cautious frog was alone, right? You, s- and I think we see this in certain sort of group dynamics. Some people have more of that adventurous, like confidence to go out and do, and there are other people who are more like the whoa, 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 like hold on, wait, right? And the two kind of balance each other out through dialogue. And I feel like that's really the sort of the insight of the ancient Greeks as well, that the importance of dialoguing with other people when we're trying to make a decision, right? We kind of gather, what do you think about this scenario? What do you think about that scenario? What is really the right course of action? You try to get feedback to feel out the way, so as to avoid mistakes, right? But then also to get that confidence of doing it oneself. And that happens in these characters in the scriptures and in the history of salvation. God is the one who calls, right? We're in dialogue with God, and that's the essence of our prayer life. And dialogue is just not, empty or pointless or meaningless. Dialogue ultimately goes to action, leads to action, whether that's a deeper relationship with God or whether that's the fulfillment of what He wants of us in our lives. And that's what, Joseph of the Old Testament, Joseph in the New Testament, right? That is really, yeah. As you were talking, those thoughts were coming to my mind as well. That the call comes from someone, right, or the call to action usually, right? And we need to
Right.
heed that call, right?
Right.
And like you were saying, sometimes it's as direct as a dream. Other times it's sort of like reading the circumstances, like, right? The well or our pond is drying up, right? That's a maybe not directly caused by God, but there is somehow God wants us to use, I don't know, our ability to think prudently, to make decisions, and then put it all in His hands, and He'll work with that, right? That's always been a lifelong question for me in the faith life is like, where does God's initiative begin and where does human initiative begin? And how do they overlap? Is it just like, do I wait around for God to like start putting things in motion? Or do I put things in motion and then hope that God will meet me where I'm going? Does that make sense?
Sure.
At the same time, I don't want to just be like, subscribing to the rugged individualist kind of mentality of like, I'm just going to, carve through life and, do it my way. Anyways,
Well, your 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 point about going out, that the two frogs go out in two, right? There's two of them.
right, right.
And that importance of the dialogue, because they balance each other out. I was thinking Christ sends out his disciples in
Twos,
twos,
2 by 2.
right?
Right.
I'm sure there's a lot of different reasons that Christ did it, but I would like to imagine that they were there to support each other, right? To
Yeah.
dialogue with each other, not just to dialogue with those they were going to encounter, but to dialogue with each other, so
Right.
that when they came across a well of a situation,
Right.
they could communicate together on how to proceed,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And yes, for companionship, for fellowship, for friendship, for strength in numbers, uh, to be more of a witness, for any number of reasons I'm sure that
Mm.
Christ had. I mean, Christ was, God personified, so surely there is an extreme amount of brilliance that I cannot fathom,
That's
you
right.
know. So these two frogs go out together and they see the well
Right.
together and they can talk about it. But what we don't consider here
Right.
is right. We go to the moral, it says, do nothing, without considering the consequences.
Right.
But it doesn't say, it makes it sound, and maybe that's what Aesop meant. But for us in our Christian faith, it's not the end of it. It's like, oh, well, the well might dry up, so we shouldn't do it. This
Right.
is where sometimes God is asking us for a opportunity to make an act of faith.
Right.
It's like the well very well may be where they need to go. And yes, consider the consequences. Discern through the decision.
Right.
God's calling you to move across the world. It's like, yeah, but that country could go to war,
Right.
but they may not.
Yeah.
That well may not dry up.
Right.
That well may stay full forever. And that may be the home that God is calling those frogs to, in a
Right.
matter of speaking.
Yeah.
So together, they should be able to discern and talk and say this and that, and it could dry up, it may not dry up. What are we being called to? Where is our home?
Yeah.
So God will put these moments in front of us
Right.
to decide whether we think that the water in the well is going to go dry,
Right.
whether the water in the well is going to overflow,
Right. Yeah.
and that either way we have to make a decision
Right.
and know that, if we do it in honest faith to say, all right, I believe God wants me to do this, that God's going to work with us somehow.
Right.
Maybe the water does dry up.
Right.
All right, it was a bad decision, but we did it trying to follow God's will.
Right.
What do we do now? Right.
Right.
Then you're faced with that. But in the
Right.
time, we do our best after we've expressed caution, after we've let our intellect and our will sort of churn it out and say, all right, God, I'm gonna step in the well. I'm gonna step out of the boat
Right.
and
Right.
I'm gonna come walking.
Right.
And I'm gonna try and stay focused on you. I'm probably gonna sink. But I'm gonna try.
Right.
The well is probably gonna dry up, but I'm gonna try,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know. So we can't leave it only at like, oh, it looks like it could be dangerous, so we shouldn't do it.
Right.
It may be the thing God's calling you to do.
Yes. And that brings up another point as well. Risk versus reward, right? If we want to do anything in life, there is always going to be an element of danger, right? Or an element of risk, right? And we cannot let that risk keep us from doing what we're supposed to be doing or what we feel we're being called to. And that's, I feel, as well, the brilliance of the Aesop fables. Aesop leaves the story at the question. Well, suppose the water should fail us. How can we get out again from so great a depth? End of story. End of dialogue. And we're left wondering. The Aesop doesn't say, and they both decided and prayerfully discerned that
Right.
that the well was the best place, and in fact, they lived happily ever after. No, the whole point is like the story just leaves us hanging right here. It's like Aesop doesn't even give us like any further discussion from the frogs. It's just the question that leaves us like teasing our brains and our intellects to kind of get us thinking about that. And I was thinking about the word discern. Again, I had to look it up. It comes from the Latin discernere. Dis means apart, and cernere, to separate, to sift, to distinguish. So the dis implies separation, which is exactly what you do when you're trying to make a decision. You've got this big kind of, problem, right? And then you have to kind of separate the elements of that problem. Oh, we have a drying up water source, and take that to mean whatever in your own life, what you mean. And then the cernere means to sift, to distinguish or perceive the elements within that, and then try to piece it through, right? And that's the whole discerning. But ultimately, one can engage in the process of discernment in an unfruitful way because ultimately discernment ought to lead to a decision or action or some kind of action.
Right, right.
So,
I I I think that Aesop wants people to use their brains.
mm,
You know,
hmm
maybe harmless small stories with some sort of moral, but I think Aesop wants people to think about these things in life
yes,
and wanted people to say, "Oh, I hadn't thought about that."
hmm right,
You know, and he uses animals, sometimes odd combinations of animals. Sometimes
hmm
there's people, but to make these very small points, but that are very large scale when it comes to the way they could impact your life. You're thinking, the two frogs. What? Well,
right,
read it. Now, think about your story where you had to make a decision. Think about your own life story,
right,
and you'll find the place where you had a well and you had to make a decision.
yeah,
And maybe you can look back on it and you can say, yeah, I remember that one. I was not cautious and that one hurt, you
right,
know.
yeah,
Or I was cautious and it turned out to be the right decision though. Like I made it, but I
right,
was careful about it,
right,
So I just think that
yeah,
that Aesop is so good about taking something that looks so benign and then making it into something that's really big,
yes,
you
yes.
know? And you got people who write big books and it's like, I don't know what you wanted us to garner
Where
from
were
that
you
book.
going? Right.
Can you take some notes from Aesop? He saved a
Right.
lot of paper
Right.
and told a better story.
That's right. Got you thinking, right? That is true. The point of the stories is to get us thinking about life and and Aesop's amazing insight into life as well, exemplified through these different scenarios that he paints for us.
Right, right. And here it just happens to be two frogs. And I know I have my own share of wells, plural, that I've had to sort of look at,
Mm.
and
Mm-hmm.
some that some that looked full, some that looked empty, some I wasn't sure what all was going on in the well, but had to make those decisions. Um, but here I am. I'm still, I'm still here, and but so many of those decisions, God has always been a part of them
Mm.
for most of my adult life. It was always, God,
Mm.
what do you want me to do?
Yeah. Right.
So, and again, that just think that's the important part. We have no idea if these were Christian frogs, or pagan frogs,
That's right.
uh, but you know, I could imagine a situation where the frogs were two people and were believers, and that they looked at the well
Right.
and they discerned,
Yeah.
they separated out their decisions and made a decision that hopefully was to both of their, both of their benefits, whatever that was. And then God
Right.
was like, all right, well, we're going to work with this and we're going to move forward.
Right.
But that's because they hopefully, those two people brought God along
Right.
because we make a lot of decisions in our lives. And a lot of people, obviously,
Mm.
agnostic, atheists, pagans, whatever, and their life is not led by any sort of moral truth. So
Right.
their decisions tend to take them in all sorts of directions,
Right.
right? When they see the well,
Yeah.
it's a lot different experience than those who face the well with God by their side.
That's right. Yeah. The well represents opportunity as well as danger,
Hmm.
right? And so the truly wise frog has to discern, separate what are the dangerous elements versus what are the opportunities, the good opportunities. And like you were saying, for the life of a Christian, the Christian worldview is different from someone, say, who's motivated by sort of the criteria of the world, right? the Christian sees, hopefully, with the eyes of Christ or with the mindset of Christ.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Right.
But anyways, things to take to prayer. I encourage you to read or listen to Aesop's Fable via audio theater if you haven't done so already. But Albert, it's been great to talk with you today, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, whether it's Aesop or something else, I am ready.
Awesome. Right. We'll be looking forward to it. And thanks once again for tuning in to We Are One Body Audio Theater, the table of content where fanciful fare is served for the imagination.